Hi, everybody. I wanted to talk about something different today. I want to talk about grief. Yeah. Grief is probably the most challenging of all human emotions. It's easy when things go well. With joy, we're happy. And I have a new buddy over here who's just decided to come by and say hello as I cut this video. And there's a lot of difficult emotions: anger, sadness, depression, anxiety. But grief hurts. Grief is just the kind of emotion that could just cause you to collapse, to literally just fall apart, to go weak in the knees, to wail in pain for the loss of a loved one. Many psychologists have talked about grief. Kubler-Ross wrote a whole book, or several books actually, about the stages of grief. I'm not going to talk about the stages of grief. I don't want to address this from a psychological standpoint, but I want to kind of give this more of a non-dual perspective, given the forum that I'm talking in. But I first want to recognize the challenge of grief. And there's absolutely nothing, and to talk about the fact that there's nothing wrong with it, because even though awakening might have happened, we're still human. We are still inhabiting the dream through a particular biological unit, or it's perceived to be that way. But let's not deny the fact that it's perceived to be this way. And when grief is experienced, it's experienced here, all over in this form. Now, some people might try to deny their grief, to repress their grief, even get down on themselves for even experiencing grief. Because after all, it's all one thing. So what is there really to feel grief about? We know that life is impermanent, transitions happen, and yet, when we lose someone, and I'm talking about losing a life form, losing someone. It could be a pet, could be a loved one. I'm not talking about losing a job or a house, but grief is experienced in those situations as well. But I'm talking about the loss of a life form in which we're bonded with. Grief hurts. Grief is so difficult. And there's nothing wrong with it. And I say that as someone who's experienced grief. It's been several months now, but I've been dealing with it over the past several months. In this case, it was just a beloved pet, and I shouldn't even say it's just a beloved pet. I don't want to minimize the grief. I have lost loved ones in my life. I've lost my father. I've lost my grandparents. I've lost my uncles. My dad's death took a long time. I'm not even sure I'm completely over my dad's death. He died when I was young. Friends of the family, friends of friends, friends of my brothers, my sister-in-law. I've seen a lot of death. But this death, this dog, I had a dog named Dogen, had him for 10 years, hit me really hard. And I think it hit this unit really hard because it happened after post-awakening. And I think the reason why it hit really hard was because there was an openness to the experience. There was an openness to, it was just an openness. It's so difficult to explain. And I don't want to really get into the personal side of this, but just want to let you know, it was dealt with here. Grief was experienced here. And I'm going to put his picture up with this video when I post this on the website. I have a great picture of Dogen. That's the name of the dog, Dogen. But what I really wanted to talk to you about is how grief actually has multiple levels, which can be explored which can be explored. The first level is the loss itself. That person or pet or even a situation is no longer there. And there is a biological bond that is felt with this body of that loss. And that's the first level, the loss. Suddenly that person, that being is no longer there, no longer part of the life of this unit. And it's typically the extent to which we deal with our grief. But what it can be really useful in pointing out to us is the fact that that loss is accompanied by a story of the relationship that exists or existed between the two beings. Because it is a relationship. And that relationship is a story. And I know when I lost Dogen, or Dogen made his transition, he wasn't really lost. It hurt because the interactions no longer existed, except in my head. The walks we used to go on, playtime, just the hanging out. He was a big dog. He was 10 years old when he died. His legs were bothering him. He wasn't as mobile as he was just a few years earlier. But you know how it is. For those of you who are pet lovers, you know how it is. They're not there. They're not there to provide, especially with pets, the unconditional love that pets provide. So the first level of grief is that unconditional love is gone. And there's a hole in the heart of that grief. The second level, though, is where, if you're really open to seeing this, you start to see how your own story, your own identification with a story has been created in part because of your relationship with this individual. So if you've lost a spouse or a child or a parent, that relationship no longer exists. Father, son, father, daughter, mother, son, mother, daughter. husband or wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, spouse. The relationship is gone itself. But if you really look closely, you'll see that the suffering that follows from the immediate pain of the loss occurs because of the story that has been created around the relationship. There's a story there that, if you see it, you'll notice what I'm talking about. There's a story there of you, of a me. You might see that that story of me includes that specific relationship. I am someone in relationship with another. And that is who I am. I am a son. I am a father. I am a spouse. I am buddies with a dog or a cat. The particulars of the relationship are not important for our discussion. What's important, though, is to be open to the storylines that arise as a result of the loss. And this is where non-dual inquiry can be really important. So we have the pain of the loss itself. That's immediate. That's visceral. That will happen. It's okay. If you collapse in the shower like I did, it's okay. If you bawl your eyes out, it's okay. That's being human. That's being alive. As difficult and as painful as it is, if you were not alive, you wouldn't feel it, would you? Pain is going to happen. And this is true for all situations. So you can generalize what I'm talking about to any kind of situation where loss is felt. Pain happens. You're going to feel it. Let it. Don't deny it. Don't repress it. Don't bury it. Be open to the pain. As difficult as it is to experience it, be open to the pain. That's that first level. The second level now that I'm talking about, though, is seeing the story that was created. Because now it's identification with the story that creates suffering. It's identification with the story that perpetuates the sense of loss. It shouldn't be this way. I wish he was here. I wish she was here. What am I going to do without him or her? What do I do now? How can I go on like this? Memories of shared events or situations. That's the story. That's the story of our life. Now, you should know, being on this journey and have listened to my videos and perhaps as well as others, that you know that the story is just a story. It's not true. These are just mental imaginations. The past no longer exists except in our minds. The future doesn't exist except in our minds. And so the teaching here is to allow yourself to see what stories you've created for yourself that perpetuate your suffering. And the reason why I'm bringing it up here is because I've done it. Spent several months, especially earlier on in after Dogen's death, replaying stories and memories and events in my head, and seeing, though, that when those stories arose, when those ideas arose, that when I grasped onto them, that's when I suffered. When I thought things shouldn't be the way they are, that's when I suffered. When I started remembering past events and playtime, that's when I suffered. When I started thinking about how he won't be there tomorrow or the day after, or he shouldn't have died. Again, that's a story. That's when I suffered. And when I started to see, though, that, and maybe this is really it, that our identification with the me is solidified by our identification with others. Yeah. Our identification with a me is solidified when we identify with others, by our identification with others, by our identification with our relationship with others. Because now there's contrast. Now there's the creation, the identification of a sense of me in contrast, in relationship with, in context with that relationship. This is where inquiry is important. Who's observing that thought? Who's seeing the story? Who's believing the thought? Who's having the thought? And in times of grief, sometimes it's really difficult to extricate your awareness from the storyline because it hurts. Which is why it's really important to allow it to hurt, first of all. Let it hurt. Let it hurt. Let it hurt. Let the energy keep coming up and up and up and up until it doesn't. But allow yourself also to recognize when you perpetuate your suffering by holding on to the stories of something that is no longer. Doesn't mean you forget. Doesn't mean you don't engage in reflection or storytelling. I mean, verbal storytelling. You never forget. You know that. You don't forget your loved ones who've passed or transitioned. You can tell fond stories and you could laugh and joke. Maybe not in the beginning, but over time, you're able to enjoy the storytelling about a particular individual in your life who has transitioned. But what I'm talking now here is seeing that your sense of me is in part created and solidified by your identification with your relationship with others. And that can be really powerful when you see that. Because even if you might recognize that your me is an illusion, grief will sometimes bring you back into that identification. Even when there's a sense of great clarity, grief will show you where you're still not clear. It'll show you where you're still identifying with a story, with a me, with a relationship that builds the story, that creates the me. So we have two levels we've discussed so far: the pain of the grief and the suffering that follows, that can be alleviated by seeing that where there are still identifications with a me. And again, sometimes we don't think that even if we've seen through the illusion of the me, grief will bring back those identifications. Now, maybe not for everybody. This is what I went through. This is what was experienced over here. But I suspect that for those of you who've had some form of awakening, have seen through the illusion of the self, the small self, the me, the ego, that when a situation like this arises, you might become aware of areas in which there's still identification. So it's a really good idea to be open to seeing that. And there's a third level here, though, that came to mind a while ago as I was investigating all this and working through the grief and the suffering. And this third level is more of a divine level. I don't know if I'm going to try as best as I can to put this into words. But from a spiritual perspective, you've heard that this is all one thing. That all this is the manifestation of divinity. It's God manifested. Emptiness is form. Absolute is the relative. We perceive form, and yet the basis of that form we say is emptiness or divine or God. And so there's the perception here of unique beings, but each one of them in our perceptions, animal, human, is the manifestation of the divine, is the manifestation of you as divinity, you as oneness, you as the absolute, you as awakeness, not you as the individual, not you as the character, but what gets manifested here is this character is the divine manifesting through this particular unit, and that unit, and that unit, and all the other units out there. And so what has come up over here is the sense that grief, and I'm anthropomorphizing here a little bit, so truth of this, I don't know. But I am anthropomorphizing, but it's like whatever it is we are at this divine empty level also experiences grief, because there's a loss of a particular manifestation of the divine. So this is not a personal grief. This is like a divine grief. And again, I am anthropomorphizing, and I agree, but I think you understand what I'm getting at. It's like any loss, even though it's all part of the unfolding creative nature of this freaking universe we seem to perceive, the fact that it's all part of this one thing going on, it's maybe not that there's loss actually felt, there's nothing to feel the loss, but there's still loss. And this is true for the dead squirrel on the side of the road. How many of those have you seen in your life? There was a life form right there, no longer there. There's a loss. This would be true for every aspect of reality. I'm thinking in my head now, like even a mosquito, there's a loss. Killed the mosquito, there's a loss. Now, from a human perspective, we don't want that mosquito biting us or transmitting disease, but even there, at the divine level, that's a divine creature. That's a divine manifestation of the divine in a particular form. And so, true or not, there's just a sense that there's a different kind of grief, a divine grief. There's a personal grief, and there's a divine grief. Kind of, it's tough. Because how can this brain up here, how can this thing really understand what this divine is? The character can't understand it. The brain can't understand it. We use the brain, awareness uses the brain to talk about all this. Cognition is still available. Language is still available. We can only point to the truth. And all I'm saying here is grief can be experienced at a personal level. Grief can be perpetuated, and we suffer when we believe our stories. And so the way through that is to see what those stories are that we're identifying with. That's the inquiry process. And then finally, there's just more of, whatever this is, whatever this is that's going on, whatever this creative unfolding is that's going on, there's always loss. Everything's impermanent. Life and death. Without life, there would be no death. Without death, there would be no life. Which is why maybe the point of this talk is just to talk about grief. And I'll probably approach this again later, once again, maybe more from a more practical standpoint. How do you actually work through this? Because it's going to happen. You'll lose someone. And I'm talking now from the perspective of our humanity, not our divinity. Because I really don't know. I can't say how divinity works through this. This is just divine thing doing its own divine dance, which includes life and death. So how do I close this? You are both human and divine. Be fully human, and simultaneously you are the divine. What you are is more than just the human that you are. You are a manifestation of the divine, as is all of this. All of it. All of it is you, the divine you. And it's a very interesting dance that's played. That from the perspective of this, humanity is filled with extreme emotions, grief being, as I said, probably the most difficult of all of them. So live your life fully, completely, absolutely right now, because this is it. Divine, human, human, divine, absolute, relative, form and emptiness, one and the same thing. This is it. Live it fully. Thank you.